Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It is a very strange experience because the last time I was here, I think it may have been 2005, and I remember I think we were looking at Ireland in 2030, if I remember right, Joe, wherever you are. And on that occasion, I wasn't exactly a bag of laughs in relation to the risks which we faced. But here I am now in a different capacity, obviously wearing a different hat, which I'm not sure how to put on actually at the moment because it's new. And I noticed as well that Carl made a point about silver linings and clouds there as he opened earlier on, and he was talking about this silver lining might be that everybody's interested in economics. I just want to point out that I did go around for quite a while saying during the Celtic Tiger that it was like a silver lining, but that behind every silver lining there was a cloud. But I earned my reputation. As I look at where we are right now, and Eamon made the point about there's no point becoming depressed or downbeat about where we're at now. Well, I'm not depressed or downbeat. I am mad as hell. I'm absolutely fed up to the back teeth hearing the same people say the same things that they've been saying for the last 10 years. We've been hearing it and waiting for them to do something for so long that I literally decided to get off where I was, my perch, and decide that I was going to get involved. That's why I'm here. If they hadn't made such a mess of it, I'd be very comfortably in RTE doing the job that I was doing for all those years. I don't forgive them. I think that the same people have made the same mess that got us into this, and they're trying to advise us in relation to get out of it. And I'm very suspicious about the quality of that advice. It's not easy getting out of where we're at now, and particularly in relation to the choices that we make and the choices that have to be made. And it's very clear that there is a kind of a consensus with regard to what needs to be done: fix the public finances, fix the banks, and reduce our wages and make ourselves all poor, and that somehow this is going to make everything better. What strikes me is that there are no people at the heart of that. You know, for many, many years when I was in RTE, I had to report on the economy and make a connection somehow between this dismal science and ordinary people. And all of the time what I remembered from the very beginning that one of the things, as a younger economist broadcasting, that I realised was that economists, there's no point talking to each other. Well, firstly, they disagree and they all think they're better than each other, I'll tell you that. And secondly, nobody's listening in the language that they speak. It doesn't make any sense to keep talking about such important issues in exclusive language. And the one thing which is missing from economics, and always has been missing from economics and from the textbook, is people. And that's us. But as I see now, I mean, do I need to tell you where we are? We are in the grip of a huge economic and social challenge, thanks to mismanagement on a monumental scale. And we haven't faced anything like this in our history. Certainly since the Second World War, according to the IMF, no country has been struck like we've been struck in terms of the collapse in economic growth that we're facing. When you look at what the ESRI says, and only last week I think it was, they say that GNP, what we get to keep out of our economic activity per capita, is going to fall by 16% by 2010. So we're getting poorer, and we're going to be taking more and more cuts. In the first 6 months of this year, just to give you a potted history of it, 127,000 people were added to the dole queue. That's 1,000 people for every single working day on average this year. It's just a huge, huge figure. We have 420,000 people unemployed, although some purists will tell you when they're on the dole they're not unemployed. Well, that's just rubbish. They are unemployed. The growth in the numbers on the dole have been people seeking work and people who don't have anything to do, and we all know that. So we have 420,000 people, and it's going up like a rocket. In no time it will be very close to 500,000, 1,000 people per day. It is an absolute shock and a disgrace. It's affecting every single family, every single community, every single class of people. It's indiscriminate on this occasion, and it's the result of enormous failure. So 420,000 people, and we have 1.9 million people still in employment. I'm delighted to have such a high number in employment, but when you consider it's nearly, well, if you had, it's certainly more than one in five or 1 in 4 when you consider 1.9 million people with jobs, 420,000 people on the dole. The burden on people with jobs is enormous and is growing by the day. They're expected to pay taxes for absolutely everything. And it's like as if they're not entitled to any break whatsoever. The Quarterly National Household Survey, which measures employment, tells us that we are losing 30,000 jobs every month. And that was figures for the quarter ending in March. And you know where our public finances are, because we've heard all about it in recent weeks, in tatters. Because nobody has ever experienced such a rapid slump in taxation collected out of economic activity. At the start of 2007, when I was not involved, as you know, in anything related to politics, the Department of Finance gave a forecast. They said on the basis of the way the economy is going and on their expert prognosis that by 2009, this year, 2 years later, the Exchequer could comfortably expect to have 56,000 million euro to play with. 56 billion euro in taxes from the economic activity that we have. A very big sum. And it was on the basis of the 56 billion that all of the political parties, my own included, I can talk about it because I wasn't there, decided to draw up programmes and promised the electorate all sorts of goodies, massive and expensive ones. And they were egged on by the fact that 2010 and 2011 would have much more money. So 56,000 million. And they were huge promises. Well, it has turned out to be quite a disaster, as you all know. Were it not for the massive tax hikes in the two budgets that Minister Brian Lenihan brought in October and in April, the amount of taxes that would have been collected if you take away what he raised would have been 31 billion this year. That's the forecast. That's 45% short of what the Department of Finance and the experts there told us we could play with 2 years ago. That is a phenomenal shortage. It's huge. And the result, as you know, is 20 billion euro of borrowing and the need to do something about that. But the root cause of this fiscal collapse is the unbalanced nature of our economy and the unbalanced nature of the structure of our taxation system. And I won't go on about it, but we know the government got carried away on fair weather taxes, on the building boom, which is a great source of employment for everybody and a great source of hope and wealth and so on, but they were making money hand over fist. I remember on one occasion reporting for a report on RTE that for every single house sold in this country between new and second hand, on average, and I think this was around 2006 when I was doing this documentary, on average the government was getting 100,000 euro in taxes of one kind or another out of each particular house sale on average. They were lapping it up and egging it on, and they got used to that kind of fair weather tax. But the problem with it, because it was based on a building boom, everybody knows it can't go on forever. So everybody knows that those tax receipts are to some extent short-term in nature. What they did in relation to the short-term revenue is they took it for granted that it would go on forever, and they made commitments which were extremely long. Very long-term, massive commitments. Pretty much like what the banks did. The banks borrowed short. They borrowed money over very short periods in the wholesale money market for, say, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, or whatever was available, the cheapest money, and they lent it in mortgages for 20 years, assuming they could always go back and roll it over in the money markets, borrow short, lend long. Well, we did the same. The government did the same. They took fair weather taxes and they assumed that they would carry on forever, and we were caught the same way as the banks. Taxes on the average worker here were cut. As you know, we were the lowest in the whole industrialized world except Mexico and Korea. So everybody did benefit from the lower taxes. But it was never sustainable. The structure was wrong. It was obvious it was wrong. I went down repeatedly to the Department of Finance press briefings, and we frequently brought up the issue of the structure of the taxation system, and we were brushed aside. We were told that nothing to worry about. When we started to say, when you look at stamp duty, it's almost as much you're collecting there as from the whole corporate sector, that was nothing to worry about. Well, we're worried now. It was an irresponsible approach to the structure of the taxation system, and it went on for years by the same people who were going to cut our way out of it. Official figures will demonstrate for you just how badly the system is structured. Because if you look at the budget which was produced in April of this year, it will tell you something. It tells you that, well, firstly, the government now thought, or at least the Department of Finance thought at that stage, that economic growth or activity would fall by 7.75% this year. But it also said that we would, if they hadn't raised taxes, they would have had about 31 billion euro of taxes, as I mentioned earlier. The thing with the 31 billion of euro of taxes is that it's 27% lower than the amount of taxes collected in 2008. So for a 7.75% fall in economic activity, they were going to get 27% reduction in the taxes collected. 3.5 times, a multiple of 3.5 times the amount of taxes fell compared to economic growth. The structure was completely wrong. Has been wrong, has been designed wrong, they championed it, they poo-pooed anybody who said there was a problem with it, and now they're saying we have to pay the cost. Well, we do have to pay the cost. So savage cuts in public expenditure, further tax hikes are now inevitable, unfortunately. And the government, as we know, has promised our European partners that they're going to take 4 billion euro out of our pockets through the budget next year, in December. 4 billion again the following year, followed by 3.5 and 3 billion in the following 2 years. The whole point is to get by 2013 down to a point where we will have an exchequer or a general government borrowing to balance the books 1 year on that final year 2013, that the amount they'll have to borrow will be the equivalent of 3% of all of the economic activity that goes on. A 3% general government deficit. Because they think that that's good management, and it does. That makes some sense in terms of a traditional target in terms of Europe and in terms of the single currency. But the menu of likely cutbacks we saw last week from the report of the McCarthy Group is 5 billion euro, 17,500 jobs, and there are some people who say we should start right now and implement the whole lot of it. Now, those people didn't go knocking on doors like I did all around Dublin South for 4 weeks of an election campaign, because those people who want to just go ahead with it, I believe they don't understand fully what impact it will have on people. I had people with tears in their eyes, people crying over special needs assistance. People crying left, right and centre in terms of trying to deal with people who have Alzheimer's and their difficulties in interacting with the services that were available. Right, yeah, I could go on and on. The amount of pain that these kind of cuts, even at the moment, have impacted on people is enormous. So the idea that we're going to do 5 billion euro and say, right, now we're fixed, I just don't think that it's going to be anywhere near as easy as that. It's people, ultimately. The economy is about people. I don't think the people are about the economy. What we're going through now is not a normal recession. Our banking system, as you know, has collapsed and the prosperity has been destroyed. Unemployment is where it is, and living standards are plummeting. I heard the Minister on Pat Kenny's radio station after the last budget say we have to accept lower living standards. He must have said it 7 times. I'm not accepting lower living standards. Sorry. It's just not acceptable. We need to do something to recover our living standards. I'm not willing to sit by and let people just say you've got to take cuts, cuts, cuts and get poorer, poorer, poorer. It's not on. There's nothing but fear now and retrenchment among businesses and workers alike, and there isn't a lot of hope, if you ask me, been offered or been put forward by those in charge. The fact the government feels that it's no choice now but to cut public spending so drastically and raise taxes as spectacularly as they appear to be prepared to do, and just signals how badly they've got it wrong. This is the worst possible moment for that kind of action. And I'll give you an example. We all talk about the IMF report, the recent report on the Irish economy, and we had a special debate on the Dáil in it eventually, which was forced by both of the opposition parties and agreed to, in fairness, by the Minister here himself. And it was a worthwhile debate because the IMF is considered to be very important in terms of what it's going to say, and will afford it a lot of credibility. But this is what their staff note said on almost New Year's Eve, just gone past, about the most appropriate fiscal policies in the current environment. They said that the fiscal policies, and they were talking about dealing with the financial crisis and the difficulties we have, should be timely, large, lasting, contingent, collective and sustainable. They said they should be timely because the need for action is immediate. They said they should be large because current and expected decreases in private demand is exceptionally large. They said they should be lasting in terms of the amount of money they're putting into the economy because the downturn is going to last for some time. They said they should be diversified because of the unusual degree of uncertainty associated with any particular measure. And they said that they should be contingent because of the need to reduce the perceived probability of another Great Depression. and that would require commitments to do more. And they said, looking at the content of the fiscal package that would be appropriate in the current environment, they said that spending increases and targeted tax cuts and transfers are likely to have the highest multiplier effect. Now you listen and consider what we're talking about and have been talking about here for a long time. On every front mentioned by the IMF in that note, our government and our policymakers are doing the exact opposite. If anything is a testament to massive failure, that is. Our hands are all now tied behind our back, and our head is wherever you wish to describe it, but certainly in the sand. It's a mistake, I believe, because this is a disaster. It is nothing short of an economic disaster we've been led into. It is a mistake, in my view, in these circumstances, to proceed to correct the sudden and catastrophic imbalance in our public finances at the pace that is now being planned. The government's objective is to bring that general government deficit down to 3% by 2013, and that's been forced upon us by the rules of Europe's single currency. It's called the Stability and Growth Pact. Now, those rules are fine, and I understand them, and I thought they were a great idea under normal circumstances. We're using somebody else's money. We all have a joint money. We have to be careful how we use it. Make sure you don't go ruining your economy by borrowing too much. That's fair enough. But that's not where we're at. This isn't a normal circumstance. The blow to the Irish economy is much too severe. In the 1980s and throughout the 1990s, Ireland made huge efforts, and I remember reporting on them and working on them, and I used to work in the central bank and places like that, huge efforts to qualify for Europe's single currency. And the big debates were had about we were going into this single currency, we'd be throwing away some of our policy instruments such as the currency, and we would become a region. And there were fears that in that economic union, which would be big, it would have Germany and France and Italy. In those days we were afraid of those guys, that all of the economic activity would be sucked out of Ireland and sucked out of peripheral countries and basically migrate to Europe, where there were bigger profits to be had. As a result, we had regional policies. And you'll remember we used to be Objective 1, you might still be in Donegal, Objective 2, for structural policies. And we had cohesion funds, and we had all sorts of money coming from Europe to ensure that as a region Ireland was not left backward. It's not Europe's intention to turn Ireland into an economic backwater. In 1988, Maurice Doyle, who was the governor of the central bank, I remember there was a controversial speech which he was responsible for. He spoke about the idea of a rust belt, the idea that Ireland could become a backwater. I think the term he used was the Appalachia of Europe. And nobody wanted it. Europe doesn't want it. It's not intended. But that's where we're heading if we keep going on this front. And Europe does not intend Ireland to be a burden again. We'd be back with a begging bowl if we impoverish ourselves with a view to trying to be too upright in terms of reaching a 3% deficit by some fake deadline of 2013. This is an extraordinary period we're living through, and we need to stand up to the people who are trying to push us into that corner so that we can have the choices that we need to have to put people first. You see, 20 years on from Maurice Doyle's fear, there is really that fear that we could become this black spot. This is very depressing, what we're looking at. It could possibly become, if they get it wrong in terms of policy, if the banks don't respond in terms of lending, if all of the taxes are piled on our shoulders, if all of the services are cut, and there's no massive or quick economic recovery globally, which you cannot rule out, we cannot rule out it will take much longer for the global economy to pick up, well then we will be in serious trouble. And we can't afford, because one thing will feed off the other, we cannot afford to make that mistake. We have lived through periods of high emigration, and I have no intention of idly sitting by while we walk into another one. We must get economic growth back. I saw today, and I've listened and I've seen over the last couple of weeks, people speaking about our crisis in our public finances and how we have to cut everything right now because the revenue has fallen. Well, we really should focus a little bit more on trying to recover the economic growth so that the problem isn't all on the back of cuts and tax increases. To get more economic growth into the country, maybe we won't have to cut so much and maybe we'd have a little bit more time. Now, obviously, the global economy needs to pick up, but we need to do a little bit more ourselves. The best cure is robust economic growth. And such economic growth, as you know, will mean more activity and more taxes for the government. It's impossible, in my view, to get out of this situation without a restoration of economic growth. And some of the international environment, well, all of the international environment is outside of our control. But the government's strategy is to do everything in its power to prepare for this supposed economic recovery internationally by slimming down the public sector, raising taxes on all and sundry, and ploughing billions of euro into our broken banks. There are a lot of risks in all of that. And I believe that it is expecting too much of already heavily indebted, highly taxed, insecure, fearful domestic taxpayers to fund all of that out of declining wages and fewer jobs. It is outrageous to suggest that it's all on our backs and that nobody is going to do anything inventive to promote economic growth. Unless the global economy experiences what now it'll have to be one of the fastest recoveries since Lazarus got out of his bed and walked, then the burden of fiscal adjustment on ordinary people that the government is planning to impose is just going to be too great. We need to make a stronger case at European levels for greater recognition of the real difficulties that we're in and of the fact that the cure proposed by conventional economics runs a very, very significant risk of making our problems substantially worse. What is so sacred, does anybody know, about having a general government deficit of 3% by 2013? Can anybody really put their hand on the heart and say why that's really critical right now? It's not, especially if achieving that target runs the risk of turning what is a very significant economic recession into a depression. It's true that one of the lessons of the 1980s was that running large fiscal deficits and losing control of our public finances did ruin the economy. And it's true that cheaper public sector would reduce the burden on the productive sector of our economy. It could also contribute to lower taxes than we otherwise might have. And if we get all of those things, that would help improve competitiveness. But timing is absolutely critical. Timing is important. If we try and do it all too aggressively, and if the global economy does not recover as people would wish in their dreams, well, then the social and political costs could be extremely high. And in that regard, trying to adjust our public finances too aggressively without at the same time working hard to find ways to promote economic growth here, in my view, could end up being socially and in other ways disastrous. But the need for correction in the public finances is not the only area in which we are risk paying an extremely high price for irresponsibility. A rush to bail out the banks and to save each and every one of them at great expense to enormous taxpayers is, in my view, extremely risky. Ireland is now, believe it or not, a regional economy. That's what we are. We're an area in an economic and monetary union. We don't have our own money. We don't have our own currency. We don't have our own interest rate. Our central bank takes its cue from Europe. Our regulator is fitting in with the regulations in Europe. We don't have any independence. We're a region. And that's it. We've entered that new monetary world for 10 years. But it strikes me that the mindset in terms of policy behind the scenes in some of the areas in the public sector is still stuck in that last century. Why would any region in a big economic and monetary union feel that it is absolutely imperative to save every single bank in its region and to pile the cost of that saving and those bailouts onto the backs of ordinary taxpayer? It defies logic. Banks go bust everywhere, quite regularly, even in the United States. Why does our government think that all Irish banks, irrespective of the cost, must be saved? The Taoiseach has recently said that he'd be standing there with a chequebook to save any Irish bank. At least that's the quotation. I think that is absolutely barmy. Why? At the height of the mad spending spree and the lending spree, do you know that Irish banks were borrowing the equivalent of 45% of our GDP on international money markets and lending it on to property developers and investors and anybody else here? Any bank could have done that. They don't have to be Irish. Why are we fixated with the idea that some of these banks who behave so irresponsibly should be put on our shoulders to pay with our taxes at the worst possible time? We need to be much more careful about the bills that we're paying. Last September, the government gave what was the most generous guarantee that any government has ever given to a banking sector in the face of a crisis. Now, in fairness, they will tell you that they had good reasons to do it. And I can't argue because I wasn't there. And it was a very, very difficult time. But the guarantee promised that us and you, Irish taxpayers, would refund all deposits in Irish banks if those deposits were lost due to a bank failure. And it also promised that us, ordinary taxpayers, would pick up the bill for any defaults on any money loaned to an Irish bank by any other bank or investors, including subordinated debt and bond investors. That guarantee was to last for 2 years till 2010. At the time, that guarantee was portrayed by the government as being essential in order to ensure a regular supply of liquidity to the banking system and save it. And it was all done behind closed doors, and we've no idea what debates took place because they're secret. But that guarantee is far too generous. No other country anywhere gave as much. Irish taxpayers are now far too exposed to the losses in relation to the banking system, which you cannot trust. They're quite capable of lying. They're quite capable of taking 7 billion in borrowings and presenting it as a deposit. I don't trust a single one of them, and I never will. Almost there. But in the meantime, so no other country has been as generous, and it's all us. And in the meantime, €7 billion of our money has been piled into the banking system with precious little new lending to show for it. There's a widespread view among the public that when it comes to banking, and I think the public is right, that we are paying far too much for far too little. And all of this is before we learn how much this proposed National Asset Management Agency is going to pay the banks for their damaged assets. We are so exposed. There is no sane reason, in my view, why Irish taxpayers should continue protecting investors, particularly subordinated debt investors who bought bonds issued by Irish banks. Those investors are private risk takers, and they should be made to live with the consequences of the risks that they've taken. There's €18 billion. There's €18 billion of subordinated debt, and at least half of it is guaranteed by us for no reason other than the fact that we don't know why the government gave that guarantee. Well, we have a guarantee in place for 2 years. In September next year, that guarantee is up for renewal. We had legislation in the Dáil which enables the Minister to just sign a piece of paper and renew the guarantee. But I believe very strongly that in September next year, we need to redraw that guarantee. We have to walk away from those subordinated debt holders, leave them on their own. It shouldn't preclude, I think that we have to tell them that their guarantee is up, and that shouldn't preclude the government from the normal use of that guarantee for the wholesale borrowing of Irish banks if it's needed. But it would help to send a message to the international financial markets that the government is reducing this massive debt exposure that it has placed on our backs in a rational way, and it's not lumbering us and ordinary taxpayers with debts and obligations that they should have no liability for. We have lived through a period of enormous irresponsibility, absolutely catastrophic irresponsibility. Irresponsibility in the way the government managed the economy, in the way the banks behaved, in the way developers and associated professions also engaged with the opportunities that were there. We've had irresponsibility also, we'll have to accept, in the personal sector because many people took on far too great big debts. But this irresponsibility is just crucified the economy because of where we're at. And it has resulted now, particularly at policy level and at government level and at banking level, in that a situation where trust has been shattered. Well, the restoration of trust is absolutely essential to the restoration of our prosperity. There can be no demonstration of how important trust is than when you just consider what happened when trust broke down between the banks. When they didn't trust each other, they wouldn't lend to each other. When they wouldn't lend to each other, the whole stock market collapsed and bank shares were wiped out 95% of their value and everything else went with it. Trust is the glue that keeps prosperity together. It's absolutely critical in terms of everything in our society and in our economy, and it has been damaged by the fact that we have wandered aimlessly in all those years of irresponsibility. So it seems to me unlikely that our economy can be restored to full health without the restoration of that trust. And that is an enormous challenge, because when trust is broken, you know yourself, with a friend, a relationship or anything else, it is extremely difficult to actually repair it. So but we have to work hard at that. What Ireland needs, in my view, is a new era of responsibility. That's what we need to usher in, where government takes responsibility and it stands up for you, for ordinary people. That's, again, the face of powerful vested interest, whether those vested interests are banks or social partners or Europe. We need an era where banks are held to account for the massive public rescue effort that they've been gifted with, and they're forced to play a far more active part in restoring credit flows throughout the economy. We need an era where the fiscal burden of adjustment placed on ordinary workers and ordinary taxpayers and ordinary people takes into account the responsibility to ensure that those very people are not broken by the weight of that burden and the unacceptable pace of adjustment. We need to usher in this new era. And in my view, what has happened in the political area is that leaders have failed. They've failed because they're supposed to take responsibility for their mistakes. If you fail to take responsibility, then you've got to recognise that you lose people's trust. And when you lose people's trust, you can't govern. You can't lead. And the one thing this country needs right now, in my view, is leadership. Thank you.